I'm Joe Arnold, president of the Louisville Forum, and welcome to our July 2023 meeting. We meet on the second Wednesday of each month at Vincenzo's restaurant in downtown Louisville, and all are welcome. Founded in 1984, the Louisville Forum is a nonpartisan public issues group that hosts debates and discussions of contemporary and sometimes controversial public policy issues that affect the greater Louisville community. For more information on the Louisville Forum, our programs, or to make reservations, please visit louisvilleforum.org. Today's program, Roe Reversal. How should Kentucky apply the Supreme Court ruling? Though the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade on June 24th, Kentucky's two abortion providers continue to provide abortions today because a Jefferson Circuit judge issued a temporary restraining order blocking Kentucky's trigger law that bans nearly all abortions. Now, as the courts determine whether the challenges to that law are legitimate, there are many questions about the application of the law. Our two panelists today are diametrically opposed on the question of how Kentucky should act on this issue. Each will have 3 to 5 minutes to make opening remarks before we take your questions. First up, Tamarra Wieder. She serves as the Kentucky State Director for Planned Parenthood Alliance Advocates based in Louisville. As the State Director, Tamarra manages organizing, legislative advocacy, and electoral efforts to promote, protect, and advance access to sexual health, education, and reproductive rights in Kentucky. Prior to joining the team at Planned Parenthood of Indiana and Kentucky in 2015, Tamarra worked for the ACLU. Tamarra holds a master's in international relations and diplomacy, where she specialized in global health law and reproductive rights. Please welcome Tamarra Wieder.
Thank you so much. We are in a national health care crisis. The Supreme Court has ended our federal constitutional right to abortion and overturned Roe v. Wade, turning its back on nearly 50 years of precedent. The court has failed us all, especially our most vulnerable communities who have arguably been living in a post-Roe reality. Due to barriers to accessing abortion, other healthcare especially our most vulnerable communities who have arguably been living in a post-Roe reality due to barriers to accessing abortion and other healthcare services, which has always existed in the Commonwealth. Barriers like finding childcare, taking time off of work, and navigating the cost of transportation and lodging associated with traveling hundreds and now even thousands of miles to their closest abortion provider. Again, this is a national healthcare crisis, and we are seeing in real time the devastation caused by overturning Roe v. Wade and denying people access to healthcare. With this new decision, the number of people dealing with these obstacles to get essential health care they need will skyrocket. And the Republican-dominated Kentucky General Assembly and organizations like Addia here directs are more of a direct threat to the health and well-being of Kentuckians and their right to decide if and when they want to start a family now more than ever before. I'm here this afternoon to reaffirm that Planned Parenthood Alliance Advocates of Kentucky will not back down in this fight for a person's right to reproductive health care and bodily autonomy. We have the majority of Kentuckians behind us. And I'm going to say that again. We do have the majority of Kentuckians behind us in supporting access to safe and legal abortion, and we must do everything within our power to protect it. And how do we protect it? The answer is simple right now, by voting no on Amendment 2 this November, a dangerous constitutional amendment that would explicitly eliminate any state right to abortion in Kentucky. Right now, it's our Constitution keeping our doors open, and we must not allow legislators to come between a patient and their doctor. Make sure you are registered to vote, and join the coalition working against the amendment at protectkentucky.com. We know that these bans are not what the majority of Kentuckians want, and we need each other and every voice in this fight to protect Kentucky access.
Next up, Addia Wuchner is Executive Director of Kentucky Right to Life and Chair of the Yes for Life Alliance. In her 14 years in the State House representing Boone County, she was the first woman to serve as chair of the House Standing Committee on Health and Family Services. During the Bosnian War in the early 1990s, she helped lead 9 international missions to Bosnia and Croatia. Wuchner is a registered nurse and a healthcare professional for more than 3 decades. Addia?
Thank you, Louisville Forum, and thank you, Joe, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting us here to have this conversation, this dialogue, and share your lunch hour on a very difficult subject to talk about right now. It is, for 49 years, the issue of abortion has torn this country apart. There have been great debates, there have been protests, there have been marches. We've heard what took place just this past June. Many of us have waited many years. Many of you have been the foot soldiers that have been there praying, and wishing that things would be overturned. Tamarra and I have met many times. During my time in the General Assembly, we even sat down to talk about what are the things that we could agree on when it comes to women's health care, and there are many. As a healthcare professional, as a nurse who started right here in labor and delivery at St. Anthony's Hospital, and most of you will know that hospital doesn't exist anymore, so start counting the years and you'll probably figure out how old I am. But I started my career in labor and delivery right here, taking care of moms, making sure that they had the care that they needed, because at that time, much of that healthcare need and obstetrics was outreach into the communities. So as we pause now, a nation of 49 years, the fight now and the discussion comes back to the states. Abortion's topic today, Roe Reversal. It's not new in our discussion. The matter of abortion and women's health continues. Many will probably find some common ground that we can talk about when we talk about passionately about women's health. For over 40 years, I've worked in corporate health sector. As a former state representative, worked on many pieces of legislation that were not only for women's health and pro-life, but also pro-woman, and pieces of legislation to protect children from abuse and neglect, and making sure that they have the health care resources that they need. As a bioethicist, and a nurse, I've sat at the patient's sides, and I've listened to their issues that are important to patients over the year. I have always, as an ethicist, fought for the right to life. I've been passionate, and I will not ever decry that. I've been unabashedly pro-life, pro-woman, and pro-family. So 19 days after the historic reversal of Roe, is there any common ground? That's the question I put before all of you. That's the question that you'll have to think about this November when you have the opportunity to vote on a constitutional amendment. We talk about what most Kentuckians want, but by the makeup of the Kentucky General Assembly, most Kentuckians have sent members of the House and Senate to be their ambassadors, to be their representatives, to push a button, either yay or nay. And when they cast that vote, I know, I'm a former member of the General Assembly, you're casting that vote to represent your constituency, your home base, your community, and Kentuckians. What they have done in a manner is this November, they're giving you Kentuckians the ability for the first time to push a button and vote yes for life. We have a supermajority yes in both chambers, reflecting the values of Kentuckians, reflecting the values and the pro-life values of Kentuckians. It says Kentuckians care about women and they care about the unborn child. I guess what I want to talk about as we talk about this area of self-determination for women, the responsibility of ensuring that if she becomes pregnant, she can do what she wants to. The point of departure that we share on women's advocacy is because we differ on some very critical matters on human biology, when life begins. And for all of us, and when you cast the vote this November, you're going to have to ask yourself that question. The members of the General Assembly have asked themselves that question. And for over 100 years, the laws of Kentucky have reflected the values of Kentucky. Kentucky has been a pro-life state. You can go back to 1910 and move forward. And you look at the laws passed by the General Assembly over the last few years. They continue to reflect that value. But we must ask ourselves, human biology, when does life begin? What degree does women's autonomy and self-determination, to what extent would it allow her to terminate the right of another human being? It's a hard thing to think about. We say abortion, and we have camouflaged those words and language many times. They've been coded over the time as bodily autonomy. I'm all for women having the right to make healthcare choices. We make some of the major choices. I see some that I knew from the insurance industry when I was a legislator. Women are the major deciding factor on what insurance policy to choose, selecting the healthcare for their children, what doctor to choose for their family, and whether their child is sick or not. But this bodily autonomy that will cost the life of a child, we each individually have to think about when we cast our vote this November. Can we agree with the biological research that confirms that human life from conception to fertilization begins as one life? It is a whole. Genetically distinct, the individual zygote, the human person, that organism at that time, is a member of the Homo sapiens species. It need only the proper environment to grow and develop. The only difference between the individual at that stage and adult is the form that it is in. It is not the nature. The nature of that individual is already formed. So we will debate whether we could agree on when life begins. Do we differ on human rights? Is there a hierarchy? And we must all ask ourselves, is there a hierarchy of human rights? So as we just have our discussion, I see Joe moving this way, we'll leave that to some of your questions, but it's a question for all of you. Is there a hierarchy between the rights of the mother and the rights of her child that grants her the right to terminate that life?
Thank you very much. I'll actually invite both of you to stand now, if you could, to both sides of me here. Toni Constatman is one of our board members. She already has many questions. If you have other questions, if you haven't written yours down yet, we have several board members, including Tom Van der Rostein on this side, who are happy to pick those questions up and deliver those to the back of the room. So, Toni, if you could start us off with the first questions, we'd appreciate it.
Good. And I just wanted to remind folks, just please form these in the form of a question and not like a statement, so we can make sure we ask them as questions, because I'm having a hard time with some of these to figure out what the question is. Okay, so this is for both panelists. What future legal dilemmas do you foresee from giving an unborn fetus the same status as a person?
With Ms. Wieder?
We're already seeing this play out. We're already seeing doctors unsure of how they can provide care in emergent situations. The chair of the Kentucky American College of Obstetricians and Gynecology just released an op-ed with the Courier-Journal where they talked about, even with miscarriage care right now, doctors are unsure about what they can and can't do because of the ways the law is written here in Kentucky. And we're going to continue to see this play out. I mean, all we need to do is look at Texas. Texas was turning away patients with ectopic pregnancies, and NPR covered a story where an individual was airlifted to Colorado to have her termination for her ectopic pregnancy. So we're going to continue to see, as the legislatures here in Kentucky and across the country continue to chip away at access to abortion care and taking away the ability of doctors to make judgments for their patients.
Well, first of all, as a healthcare advocate and as a nurse and worked in women's health, there is nothing in the laws of Kentucky, and I've been calling this the last few days, if you've read any of my issues in the paper, that this is scare tactics and scaremongering, and I object to that because we place fear in the hearts of women that they cannot get the care that they need. And it's very disappointing. What's going on in other states, I can't address. But I will tell you that a miscarriage is a medical situation that needs to be addressed by her physician, her healthcare provider. An ectopic pregnancy has the potential to become a life-threatening medical emergency if not addressed. It is not an abortion. The embryo, the forming child, has formed outside of the uterus within the fallopian tube. It is not a viable life, and they will try different methods to treat it. If they are not successful, they will most often have to rely on a laparoscopic surgery procedure. Again, that is not an abortion, and there should not be any confusion. Suddenly, the law changed, Roe came back to the state, and we have issued all this, what I almost call fear-mongering and inciting fear. There is nothing within the law of Kentucky that would take away that doctor's right to treat his patient appropriately.
Just a reminder, we'll allow the panelists to respond to any comments rather than the audience. Go ahead.
That's actually not true, Addia. And we've had doctors who have been calling us too as they've got referrals for their patients in Illinois right now to send for terminations for miscarriage and ectopic. When you have a pregnancy, including ectopic pregnancies, it's a termination, it's abortion. The procedures are the same.
Miscarriage often results, and we call it by medical terms, a spontaneous abortion. That can occur at home or in any setting. Sometimes it needs to be medically addressed. It needs to be medical addressed with appropriate medication and there's a couple things that can take. The woman's uterus, I'm sorry, I know this is lunchtime, will expel that child naturally with bleeding, and it's a great loss to that woman who's trying to achieve a pregnancy. Or it may require medication to pass it along so that she does not end up with an infection from retained embryo or the developing child. Sometimes it requires a DNC. Nothing has changed. These have been the treatments for years and years and years, and nothing has changed in that medical. The only thing that has changed, because my office has received the same calls, is that suddenly there's this fear that physicians are not going to be able to adequately treat their patients. So one of the things that we're doing now is to calm that fear and to talk about what the law of Kentucky does, what the trigger law does. Again, it says it restricts abortion in Kentucky, and that was a bipartisan vote to have a trigger law in Kentucky should Roe be overturned. On a bipartisan vote, it restricts abortion except with the exception for the life of the mother. But it does not bar medical treatment.
You want to respond, and we'll go to the next question.
The medication that is used to treat miscarriage is medication abortion, which they have in House Bill 3 further regulated and created obstacles to accessing in the state. And it's going to create a chilling effect on providers and pharmacists and even the companies that create and send them here to make it available.
I think we have an idea of, quickly.
I'm just going to respond. For many years, there's already been a pathway when physicians that is at the cabinet, when physicians have to use those medications, long before House Bill 3, we just re-upped it, that they have to report the use of those medications for women in Kentucky. That has been acknowledged in the past, and that form, which is there with the cabinet, exists today. So this isn't something new. Thank you.
Next question.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions, and I'm going to try to combine them, but try to keep words the same so you know that your questions are being asked. This pertains to child rape victims. What do we do with a 10-year-old rape victim? Similar question referring to a case from Ohio with a 10-year-old that was sexually assaulted, unable to receive abortion services. In Kentucky, there are no exemptions for rape or incest. What happens in those cases? And it seems to be dangerous to have children have to carry a pregnancy at age 10.
First of all, I've reached out to Ohio to try to establish if that was an actual case. A 10-year-old child is prepubescent. They have not started most of the time their cycle. A child may ovulate before their first period, and we know that. But the fact that we have exploited, if this case is true, this 10-year-old child has been exploited for political means is disgusting and a shame. It's a conversation that needs to take place. I don't deny it, but it's not to be exploited on the conditions that happened to this child. If a child was a victim of rape or incest, a law has been broken. And that means those that have committed that law should go to jail. But this is medical treatment for this child and not an issue that should be exploited by the media, by any of our causes, or here in this room. And I'm sorry if that offends anyone, but that's my position. Thank you.
I have nieces. I have cousins. At 8 years old, they started their periods. 8 years old. Menses is starting earlier and earlier. So I think that is really important to say, that care and reproductive health care and how and when you can get pregnant starts a lot earlier. In addition, I think it's really disingenuous how Addia just portrayed this, because there have been rape victims who have come and spoken in Frankfurt repetitively, incest victims who've advocated for a modicum of humanity within these bills, and they have shot them down. And in addition, on more than one occasion, your colleague, Representative Nancy Tate, has said that children, victims of rape and incest, should still be forced to carry their pregnancies. So to say now and recharacterize it that there should be handled differently is disingenuous to how you went through the past 4 legislative cycles where you haven't included exemptions, and even from our last meeting just a couple weeks ago on KET.
Any response?
Well, my only issue here is that a minor child usually goes through a judicial bypass. If there is an issue of rape or incest, it is before the judges because there has been a legal action that needs to take place against that who has perpetrated this child. And I was for long have stood on child abuse and neglect as a legislator. As when I first came into the House, one of the first bills I passed was to make child pornography a felony in this state, so I have very strong convictions on how we treat and care about children. Again, I go back, can we have more dialogue? And I think I said that on KET. Should there be more dialogue as we talk about this issue and explore it more? It's now in the lap of Kentucky. It's never been here before. And so as we move forward, there are future conversations. But I will say that rape is the only crime, is a crime. But what other crime do we punish the child for the crime of the father? And we always have to examine that very carefully as we work through this issue.
Okay, so this question is for Tamarra, and would you accept any restrictions on abortion?
I think that that's an interesting question because we are already in a state that has no access to abortion care if these bills are moved forward. I think that's better directed at Addia if there's any compromises that can happen because we're already in a state that is barely hanging on to any access and there's been no dialogue at the table.
So we'll ask the question, are there any abortions that you would accept?
We don't compromise on human life. It's unacceptable. If you believe, as I began this conversation and this dialogue, and if you believe that a life is formed, and you have to ask yourselves, we do not believe that there's a hierarchy of rights between the mother and the child, which would allow that mother to terminate the life of her child unless it's going to medically impact her life. So we have had bill after bill after bill that's been passed. There have been 9 bills passed. Each one of them have had an injunction or a TRO or been brought to the courts, whether it is the heartbeat bill, whether it is 15 weeks, 20 weeks, whether it's for those children that are born Down syndrome. Each one of them have been held up in the court. So all of a sudden, now we want to negotiate. So that's where we are today. Thank you.
Okay, this question was directed for Addia, and how do you reconcile Kentucky's right to privacy with the government's intrusion into women's health care choices?
Well, I don't see that. First of all, we haven't determined, and the courts are battling out where that right to privacy fits in the issue today, and that's why we're in the court in the Jefferson County and Judge Perry's court, because that's been what's been put at stake. So it is a right to privacy. I honor a woman's right to privacy with her healthcare provider, but right to privacy goes as far, and we go back to, again, that discussion, the hierarchy of is there a right, does that right to privacy trump the right of that child's life and give her the right to terminate the life of the child, her unborn child. And if you all are comfortable with that life, then you would not agree with us. But if you're not comfortable, you need to think about that because we now have to, it's on us Kentuckians to think about what that means. Do we think the right to privacy, what we do in our own home, allows us to take the life of another innocent human being?
I think that's a really interesting framing because you're allowing an individual to choose in that moment in that ballot booth, but you're not letting people to have that individual choice with their providers, and that's what we need to be having. And our beliefs and values are individualized and separate from each person based upon faith, our upbringing, and different circumstances. So you're saying take that choice and make this choice at the ballot, but then everybody else's medical decisions are compromised moving forward, and I think that's inappropriate.
Any response, or should we go?
I guess I come back to my first response. Again, this is a child that judicially has not been condemned of any crime or anything, only that they're either an inconvenience, a burden, or an untimely pregnancy. And we need to think about that as a culture and as a society, what that says about us. Thank you.
Okay, so there's a couple of questions about the mail role in this, and what can we expect for the mail order? Pro-abortion drugs, will they be lost? And if a woman cannot have an abortion and has a child that she has to fully care for on her own, will the father be required to participate legally, financially, and what support systems are out there to help this mother support her child for at least 18 years?
Maybe we'll start with Ms. Wieder and it's maybe with male M-A-I-L first, mail order, and then we'll go to male M-A-L-E.
Sure. So in Kentucky, I believe it was in 2018, there was a telemedicine ban on abortion, which made it so that you could not do medication abortion via the mail because you couldn't have the telemedicine appointment with the providers. So we already had restrictions on that care in place prior to House Bill 3, which further regulated and made it a crime to have medication abortion delivered via the mail. So currently that is not a thing that is happening and will likely not be in Kentucky. I think it's really important to recognize that as we continue to take away educational opportunities and healthcare access in Kentucky, we have 73 counties without an OBGYN. 73 counties without an OBGYN. We are in a medical desert crisis in our Commonwealth. And people are having to drive long distances for birth control, if they can even get it in their towns too. So we're going to make access to medication abortion illegal in the state when they already have very little access to birth control and reproductive health care in their communities. And I think that we need to be addressing those barriers and breaking down the inequity of access. And there has been bills the last 4 years to make birth control more accessible, and they haven't moved anywhere in Frankfurt. And this is one way to address some of the inequities in care.
Representative Wuchner, let me ask the question just so I'm clear on one thing. Does this trigger law forbid the by mail medications that we're referring to?
It wasn't, it restricts abortion to the life of the mother. But we keep bringing, can I just address House Bill 3?
Sure,
because House Bill 3, just so we know what House Bill 3, there were 6 bills in one. One was the dignified care for the remains of children, whether they were in the healthcare setting or in an abortive setting. They would no longer be counted as medical or pathological waste. And I think we can all agree on that that's what we would want for children, no matter what that setting. In the area of mail order abortions, do-it-yourself at-home abortions, that was a result of a December decision by the FDA to take away all the restrictions and all the protective measures that had been there for many years. These chemical abortions had required, just as others, for the individual to see their healthcare provider, to be examined, to know how long they are in their gestation, to get blood work, to know if they're Rh negative or not. This would be reasonable. Sometimes a young girl and a young woman, it may be her first time in meeting with her gynecological professional. Maybe all she's ever had is her school vaccines and her school physical. So now she's pregnant, and House Bill 3 reflected what had been the law previously till the FDA made those changes under pressure from the abortion industry to make mail order abortions readily available. What the law said in Kentucky, now we kind of have to set the trigger law over here. What HB 3 said, we created a new section of non-surgical abortion providers. It would require them to still see the patient, do a follow-up meeting with the patient in order to dispense those medications, so it didn't take them away. But what it did make an attempt to restrict was the mail order non-prescription coming into dorms and homes, with young women and women across the state not seeing a medical provider. It was very reasonable. Trigger law has happened, so now we're at a different position with the overturning of Roe.
Any comments on that before we move on?
I want to make a comment on medication abortion. It wasn't, the FDA restrictions were not loosened because of pressure from abortion advocates. It was loosened because it's safe and effective, and there's 22 years of medical guidance and studies to back this up. They did it based on medical best practices.
Tony, do you still have the question handy from about men? Because I separated these two, and if not, then we could just talk about. Go ahead.
It pertains to responsibility for men, and what role should they play compensating and making sure they're supportive. Should there be requirements from the government on that as well, so it doesn't fall solely on the woman? And I hope that I've characterized a couple of those questions correctly.
I think this may be the one area that we would agree on. We want responsibles. A life comes into the world. It's created by two, a man and a woman. That father has, for the lifetime of that child, a responsibility. And we would agree in making sure that laws are in place that father meets that responsibility, whether the mother decides to parent together or parent apart. It doesn't change the fact that he is a responsible party. So probably will we agree to see more laws to make sure, if we don't have enough in place, to make sure that that father is engaged in their financial and the parenting and fatherhood responsibility to their children.
I think it's also important to take into consideration like what role he had. Is this a domestic abuse victim? Is it a rape victim? Are they fleeing a situation? And to just flat out say that they have rights, I think takes more agency away from the pregnant Kentuckian, agency that they should be having in these decisions. And I also really hesitate to put my faith in Frankfurt that they are going to strengthen any social service networks, because I haven't seen that happen. There were 22 bills that have been filed the last 2 years to address maternal mortality in Kentucky, and only one bill passed, and it was the one bill that could be moved by executive order this past year. So I find it really difficult to have that faith in a system that has constantly left out the most marginalized.
Okay, so this is for both panelists. In light of the Supreme Court's opinion, should parents who are trying to use artificial fertilization be worried about about what they now can, this is about freezing embryos, and should they still be doing that, and should they be worried about that?
We'll start with the right to life perspective.
Well, first of all, that's not part of the returning of Roe. When Justice Alito returned the Roe decision to the states, it's not an issue that any of us are addressing. And it's, again, one of those scare tactics that have been sent out there that women, I just had a doctor call me the other day, or the media called me and saying, well, there's a doctor who may send all the embryos out of state to protect them. And I said, that's the silliest thing I've ever heard of. There is no dialogue, no concept right now within the General Assembly that are even thinking that way or should think that way. That's a totally different issue. And so I think I take offense that it keeps coming up to kind of move the dialogue away from what abortion is and where we are today.
I think this is the unintended consequences of the bills, that they don't fully understand the ramifications and who this is hurting. Yes, embryos are fertilized eggs, like in IVF, and there are a lot of concerns from providers in fertility care and how they're reading the bills, and not just how the doctors are reading the bills. And let me be very clear on this. It's not just a doctor's perception. It is the healthcare attorneys and the malpractice attorneys and the hospital administrations who are advising them on this. So it's not some person who doesn't have expertise. They are getting professional care in planning what they're going to do to support their patients. This is not a hobbyist looking at your bills, Addia. This is the unintended consequences of not looking carefully at the language and the effect that it's going to have, and the long-term effect on reproductive autonomy.
Could I ask, Representative, do you believe that Frankfurt will do any clarifying language in future legislation to address that question?
I think as the issue comes up from the public and an issue comes up from the healthcare professionals, they may look at that. I'm no longer a member of the General Assembly, but there may be many issues that they need to look at and address. But I will tell you, in private consultation, I also work in the area of infertility privately. And I will tell you, because one of the scare tactics that's been out there, a lot of my clients they monitor their ovulation cycle on their phone. And so they were hearing this. I said, absolutely not. That is the most Orwellian thing that I have ever heard, that Republicans will be now be monitoring your phone to monitor women's ovulation cycle. So I just want to clear that up. I have women and families that are trying to achieve a family have a very special place in my heart. Many of them have suffered many pregnancy losses. Many of them have their own story about early abortions and now find themselves later in life trying to achieve a pregnancy. So they have a special place in my heart and how I approach all of these issues.
If I could redirect as well, I'll ask the same question, and then you can say anything you like, of course, is that what about legislative clarification to the issues that you raised?
I would be very surprised to see legislative clarification, but also we on abortion advocacy, abortion rights, have been fighting to have some modicum of humanity in these bills that have been passed the last 7 years. I also want to speak as somebody who has struggled with reproductive agency. I've suffered with endometriosis since I was 18. I have gone through fertility treatments with my husband prior to my hysterectomy, trying to have a child, and we decided it was not going to happen as my endometriosis was so severe. And so we did do tracking, and we have gone down many roads to try and attain more agency over our family and our futures. And when we're looking at these digital tracking tools, you're selling your data to companies. There are companies that are tracking you. It's not the Republicans that are tracking you. It's private companies that can then do what they want with your data. You sign releases of your medical history. I remember signing the, okay, let's go, to track things. And I think that it's really important that we take control over this and not be selling our reproductive histories to digital companies. We don't know what it's going to be used for, and we don't have any guarantees that it's not going to be used against us down the road. And it's not a scare tactic, it's a reality.
This is probably an area where Tamarra and I would agree that the integrity of your reproductive health, whether it's online, because often when you're using this technology, you're using it in conjunction along with your medical professional. But if there needs to be legislation, we've done legislation before to protect intellectual integrity, and this may be an area, technology integrity, that legislators may need to look at in the future. So I'm not going to disagree with you there.
Okay, so if the government forces a woman to carry a fetus, and as a result of carrying this fetus or giving birth, the woman dies, should the family of the dead woman be entitled to government compensation or wrongful death?
First, we are here. The government's forcing her to carry a child. The decision that she makes to carry that child, in light of the reversal of Roe and return to the state, is still a medical decision made with her healthcare professional. She will decide with her healthcare professional and that team as they go through that process. There are many medical complications, high-risk OB. I know it well. Many of you may have experienced yourself high-risk situations. There is an entire team that comes along, from neonatology to the women's team to the healthcare team and to an entire intensive care team. And sometimes there comes that point where we're doing everything they can. They're trying to mature the child's lungs to get viability. And they finally have to say, it's time. Whether it's your preeclampsia or your medical condition is a condition now, we have to take that child. And viability is not possible. Your child will not live. It only may live moments. The beautiful thing now, and one of the areas that I worked on and really honored hospitals that have what we call prenatal hospice, perinatal hospice, that comes alongside that woman who knows she will not have a viable pregnancy and helps her make a birthing and delivery plan. It's not a plan for that child's demise, but a plan that honors her pregnancy and helps her through this deep mourning and this pregnancy loss. So government is not making someone carry a child, and I guess I object to that with the returning of Roe. We're acting like doctors will not be engaged in caring for their patients. Doctors will continue to care for their patients, and with that patient, help them to make, especially in those extreme circumstances, the best medical decision.
I disagree with that, and I'm not sure what state Addia is talking about here, because in Kentucky, you're not going to be able to decide whether you carry that pregnancy to term, and my understanding from your response was that it was a medical emergency, and the definitions and the narrowly tailored components of medical emergency in Kentucky are very narrow. And let's say that you're in a rural part of the state, you have to have two providers that aren't connected to agree that you need the medical necessitated abortion. You need to be at a high-level neonatal intensive care unit. Right now, that's just Louisville and Lexington. So if you're in a high-risk pregnancy and having a medical emergency, are you going to be able to get to Louisville or Lexington or West Virginia or Illinois in time? And I think that that's really taking out the realities of a decision between a patient and a provider, because it's not there. It's with hospital administrators, it's with lawyers, and it's with liability. Other states may have that choice, but Kentucky will not if we lose the ballot initiative in November.
I just disagree, being a former hospital administrator. Now, I do agree a little bit with the administrators of the hospital and the lawyers. Any lawyers in the room, I'm sorry, but we've gone up many times in a discussion about how we're going to care for a patient in a hospital and how that's going to take place. But at the same time, whether it's a pending medical emergency, sometimes the fetal demise occurs over a period of days. That woman is often transferred. There are many things. There could be a car accident, and it's an immediate decision. But again, it's going to take place in a medical setting, if not, unless she has a critical situation that happens at home. I think what happens is we're supposing all these things that could possibly happen to this woman based on the overturning of Roe that don't fit the narrative of how medicine has been practiced in the care, especially for high-risk pregnancies.
Okay, so I think we addressed the first part of this question, but since we talked about, what happens when people start dying, here's the part about the physicians. What happens when physicians are too scared to treat patients who have high-risk pregnancies due to the charges they could potentially be subjected to? This has happened in other countries and could potentially happen here.
Yes, I think, we call it the chilling effect that we will likely see, especially in obstetric and gynecology, that providers are going to leave the state. As I mentioned earlier, we have 73 counties without a practicing OBGYN. We have a maternal mortality rate that is double the national average, and it's projected that we're going to see an increase by 21% with an abortion ban in the state. And if you're a Black woman, it's 33%. The liability and malpractice is going to be high, and the fear of being able to have open and honest conversations with your patients are going to be impactful on not only retention of the doctors we have here, but bringing in new doctors into these communities and into our hospitals and teaching institutions. We'll see it not only within the medical providers, but within the pharmaceuticals as well, the pharmacies. It's going to have a drastic and chilling effect across the Commonwealth, and we cannot ignore that that's going to have a profound impact on the health and well-being of our Kentuckians.
First of all, we have had a need to have more OBGYNs. I will not argue with that. Many years ago, when I was delivering babies here, you had OBGYNs, you had family practice doctors, and as health care for delivery for expectant moms became more complicated, you saw family practice get out of the field and move into a very specialized field, and that's what obstetrics and gynecology is. It's a very specialized field for the care of women. It is one of the highest risk areas, interesting enough, when it comes to liability insurance. We know that. I've practiced with individuals as we've looked at litigation and risk of litigation. At the same time, the doctors who enter that field are compassionate and committed to that as a field that they want to serve in. So I don't think medical schools are encouraging, especially doctors, to move to the rural areas. There are stipulations that try to get them to spend so many time of their first career in medical school in the rural areas of Kentucky, and we'll continue to see exploration to expand that. When it comes to medical liability, I think those are the issues that we'll be dealing with in the future. We've made many changes in Kentucky. Kentucky was the last state, besides Florida, to have medical peer review. I know that well because I worked on the litigation, so that doctors, when they see complications, can have a conversation. Healthcare was the only field of business or that was out there where physicians couldn't come together to talk to have what we call improvement on their practices.
Okay, so this is just a clarification. We know from Addia's standpoint where they believe life begins. This is for Planned Parenthood. Where does Planned Parenthood define that life begins?
I find that that's a difficult question to answer because, all of us as individuals have an individualized perspective. When and how to become a parent is personal, it's private. And we defend a person's right to choose and to seek abortion care. We stand strongly behind it, and we stand strongly behind the medical practices and the guidance. And, 25 medical organizations openly oppose abortion bans, including the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Academy of Family Physicians, the American College of Nurse Midwives, and the American College of Physicians. This isn't a Planned Parenthood issue. This is a healthcare issue, and we are leading experts and reproductive healthcare providers within a community. And we are following the best practices.
If I could, obviously you've already spelled out when you believe life begins, but to rebut or respond, I should say, to Ms. Wieder's healthcare arguments, as well as the healthcare organizations that regard abortion as healthcare, what is your response to that?
We almost have to go back in history. Until the discovery or the scientific work, and it's probably more than you want to know, on modern birth control, what we call the colleges, all the medical schools, all the colleges, because I actually was one of the American Women in Medicine group, up until that time, they believed and scientifically, even before we had ultrasounds and all the scientific technology, that life began at conception. There were some iterations back in the day, did it begin at when there was movement or quickening? But they believed the medical books, and I can show you, beginning at conception. Then, because of the way that modern birth control first worked, they moved that thought to life began at conception, at implantation. It was done to address the pharmacy industry and the work that was being done on the research of modern birth control. Since then, science has then affirmed, especially when we look at the DNA and we look at that zygote and we know that that is an individual never to exist in time and eternity separate from their parents. Life begins. The legislatures of Kentucky have confirmed that in Kentucky law, along with many other states, life begins at conception. We have had this issue between us before. We had the issue in the courtroom the other day when the abortionist, when asked, how many patients do you see at the table when you have a pregnant mom come in for an abortion? And she could not identify that there was a life. Well, I don't know about, I don't think of it that way. Any physician or medical professional, or even you as an individual, looking at a woman who is pregnant realizes that there are two lives. We think about it from the time whether we write a prescription for an antibiotic or how we're going to address her care. There are now two lives, individually and distinct. Thank you.
If I could, one moderator discretion question for you. I mentioned the temporary restraining order earlier on the trigger law in Kentucky. Do you have any prediction on what the ultimate conclusion of this court process will be? Do you think the law will ultimately go into effect?
I'm hopeful that it won't, because Kentuckians deserve access to health care. It's important that they have non-judgmental, accurate, informed care from their providers, and that they do not have to leave the state for care that is unacceptable and dangerous.
You hope.
I hope. I'm not on the legal team, and I'm not, I believe in the jurisprudence of the court here in Kentucky, and I'm going to put faith that they will see that the Constitution supports the bodily autonomy of Kentuckians and their right to abortion.
That's right. Any prediction?
Well, you would expect we'd be coming from the other direction. We hope that the cases that were presented, that Judge Perry will use his wisdom and the law and the Constitution and all the information that was provided to him to make a just and right decision. Because the next step is just you have a temporary restraining order, and he could then, after all the information is provided, issue then an injunction of the trigger. If that happens, we're hoping that he doesn't and allows the law, and I must say, passed by the legislators that you sent to Frankfurt, to make those laws. If not, the Attorney General will continue to fight that in the courts of Kentucky, but also it's going to be critical that Kentuckians take that opportunity to voice their opinion, and when they cast their vote on November 8th to support the pro-life amendment on the ballot.
So for Kentucky Right to Life, where are the movements to improve access to SNAP, Medicaid, paid family leave, and other support for children that are already here?
Well, I can speak as a former legislator that came under my purview. There was always the aim to increase those benefits. Just this session, one of the goals from the American Gynecological Association was that women would have lengthened what we call postnatal care. The General Assembly now extended those benefits, which it had never done before, and are using those dollars for the next 5 years to extend those benefits for 1 year after she delivers. Under the maternal child health benefits, the child was covered, she was covered during delivery, but they will now extend for a year. There is more work that we can do, and we will come, the Kentucky Right to Life wants to come along and work with the General Assembly and explore what needs to be done to make sure that women have the health care that they need.
Okay. Religious freedom is a long.
Actually, I apologize. I don't think I gave Ms. Wieder an opportunity to respond to that question about SNAP benefits and other health care. I apologize.
Yeah, there have been bills 22, the maternal and infant health package, that have been filed the last 2 legislative sessions. We were able to get one of the bills through that extended postpartum care for a year. However, bills that address SNAP, bills that addressed school lunches, bills that addressed social services to help support women parenting across our Commonwealth did not even receive bipartisan support.
All right, so religious freedom is a longstanding principle here. How do we reconcile the new restrictions with the ability to safely practice one's religion if the call for abortions, in this case, tenants?
We'll start with you.
As a person of Jewish faith, my religion supports my access to abortion and allows me agency in my decisions with my provider, and I do see it as an attack on my ability. While I like to keep religion out of it, though, because I think that the most important part of healthcare should be medical best practice and not based on faith. And so I want to make sure that my provider is giving me information that is irrespective of faith, because we don't know who's walking into the room and where people's beliefs lie.
Well, as we know, the law is the law. It's not based on faith or any religion. That's long been separated by our founders. In the basis of that, and I will say, and I'll talk to, not to any one's particular religion, but we've also been contacted by Jewish rabbis here in Kentucky and across the nation, and that pro-life women of the Jewish faith who disagree. It depends on the rabbinical teaching and the error, so I've come to understand that probably more than I thought I would be engaged in. So I'm not going to argue with someone's faith here. But I will tell you that each faith has their own dimensions, but this is not a matter of faith. This is a matter about the moral relevance of the human child. And we need to kind of go back to that. I did want to add something, if I can, on a discussion that came up, because we hear about maternal death and maternal mortality. Please know that when you look at maternal mortality rates, they are not based on a woman's death, an unfortunate demise during childbirth. They are measured by that period and up to 1 year following. And the studies have shown that 40 to 60% of those mortality rates could have been prevented. In Kentucky, we know that the drug situation that we have been dealing with and the opioid epidemic has cost too many women. Even women who tried so hard to keep their child and give up their addiction while they were pregnant, when they went back, their body tolerance was now different. And often we saw that they did not make it during that postpartum period. So I just want to say that different from abortion mortality or rates compared to maternal mortality rates, that extends for a year. When we look at those numbers.
Any response, and also if you have a point that you have not had an opportunity to make yet.
Yeah, maternal mortality in Kentucky is a crisis, whether it includes the opioid epidemic or not. We have double the national average, and when you have compounding effects from pregnancy that do result in mortality, that needs to be addressed, and we do know. And I can agree with Addia that, we read that 90% of maternal mortality can be prevented, but we're not preventing it. And we're creating barriers that are only going to increase maternal mortality. These numbers are going to go up by the bans, and specifically the implementation of the trigger ban, the 6-week ban, and the Omnibus House Bill 3 from this past legislative session. We are going to see more impacted peoples across the Commonwealth who die based on these bills.
Tony, maybe one more question?
Yeah, I think this one can be combined a little bit. It's how do you measure the people of Kentucky's support for each of your positions? Should it be with elected representatives, or should it be in the form of like a ballot, referendum, or amendment type of thing?
We'll start with Tamarra.
I think that we are going to really shock the nation when we defeat the constitutional amendment in November. I think there's a lot of preconceived ideas about abortion in Kentucky and how it's supported. And because the legislature is predominantly anti-abortion, that means Kentucky is anti-abortion. This is emphatically untrue. We have been doing research the past year, and our data from across the state shows otherwise. The legislature has overplayed their hand here. And people are angry and fed up and discouraged by the obsessive focus on our bodies and not on the barriers to healthcare that people are facing in their communities. So while the legislature may be predominantly male, maybe predominantly white and Republican, that's not reflective of Kentucky. We are a diverse community, we are a diverse Commonwealth, and not everybody like me is watching session every minute. Most people that we talked to didn't know about the trigger ban, didn't know about the 6-week ban. They don't know about the abortion bills. And when we talk about labels, it leaves a lot of people out. I don't like to talk about pro-life or pro-choice because most people live in the gray. They live in the middle. They're not in the extremes. And so if you're polling on one question, you're missing a big picture and a big narrative of who we are as individuals. And we're going to win in November and change the narrative on abortion and what Kentucky looks like on this issue.
How do you measure support for your position?
I think one of the measurements is that, especially if you look at the House of Representatives is the body of electorates that are closest to the people. I served in the House. We have to run every 2 years. So you are measured every 2 years on whether you're doing a good job or not. And if you look at the members of the House of Representatives Kentucky, I'm not taking anything away from the Senate, but repeatedly that issue has polled number one in their expectation of what they expected for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. They have long waited for Roe to be overturned. They didn't rush to the streets in joy or protest. We watched some of the protests that went on, but I think we're going to see the heart of Kentuckians. There will be pockets of areas that will not vote for the constitutional amendment. But November the 8th, Kentuckians, for the first time after sending their representatives and their senators to cast their vote, will have that opportunity to vote for life and to reflect their values. Now, one of the things that we'll see along the way is making sure that truth prevails, making sure that we're able to have truth in the narrative of what the constitutional amendment does and what it doesn't. It's very simple. It just reflects that there is nothing in the Constitution of Kentucky that affects abortion or the funding thereof. And taxpayers of Kentucky have repeated over and over and over they do not want their taxpayer dollars used to fund abortion. So it reflects the values of the constituency of Kentucky. So that is our measurement as we look and what we're hearing from those across the Commonwealth. Thank you.
On behalf of the entire Louisville Forum, we thank you both for appearing today. I thank our journalists in the back. Yep. I want to thank the journalists for covering this event. On your stories, if it's possible, to include the fact that the Louisville Forum welcomes members, and this is a very involved and engaged part of our civic responsibility. I want to thank all of you today for being a part of that and for showing up and for your respect for our panelists. Our next meeting is Wednesday, August 10th. Again, reservations may be made now online only at louisvilleforum.org. Thank you. Good afternoon.